Parliament has made drastic changes to the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, which, if passed, unlocks the recreational industry. Government's cannabis master plan says the industry could be worth 28 billion rand. The amendment came as a last-minute surprise to many after submissions from the Department of Trade and Industry and the public participation process. Paul Michael Keichel is an attorney who contributed to the decriminalization of personal and private cannabis in the country. He now focuses on the legal aspects of cannabis, psilocybin and related natural medicines. Let's get his take now. Paul, thank you so much for your time. Paul Michael, I beg your pardon. Let's take a look at the legislation the way it was before. What kind of issues did it have, and how does this amendment remedy them?
The bill, as it was entirely reactive to the judgment of the Constitutional Court 2018. So it only went so far as to attempt to regulate personal and private use. There was no provision made for any sort of commercial trade in cannabis, or certainly not recreational cannabis. And to the extent that you are now seeing an unlocking or an attempt at unlocking the cannabis industry, this is because of parliamentary prerogative. This wasn't a mandate by the Constitutional Court. That stated, the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill always was riddled with all kinds of constitutional contradictions. And although there is this attempt now to make provision for the unlocking of a recreational cannabis industry, there's a lot of people in the know who say that this is an attempt to essentially shove a square peg into a round hole. You're not going to do this by amending an already unconstitutional draft piece of legislation. You're just going to tie us all up into court cases for years or decades to come. But that said, it is a step in the right direction, and it shows that Parliament and government is at least taking proactive steps towards unlocking the cannabis industry, essentially.
So what does this amendment do now for unlocking the cannabis industry?
Well, the amendment itself doesn't actually regulate a commercial trade in cannabis. What it says is that the door has been opened for further regulation. So what it does is it would essentially contemplate another cannabis bill, or a cannabis for commercial purposes bill, for lack of a better term, that would follow upon the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill being passed. It does broadly outline what sort of considerations need to be taken into account in such a consequent piece of legislation or subsequent piece of legislation, but it is not itself the piece of legislation that's going to regulate the commercial trade in cannabis. So really, it's a reaction, I would think, to the President's State of the Nation address of, what was it, a month or so ago. But it's not the catch-all, nor is it the path to salvation, as it were.
All right. So essentially, this is not the game changer, but it's the thing that could lead to the game changer.
As I said, it's an indication that government is thinking in the right direction, but it isn't itself the game changer, and it cannot be used as the game changer because, as I said, the draft bill in itself is riddled with so many inconsistencies and instances of unconstitutionality that we cannot use this as the bridge to get from A to B when it comes to commercial cannabis.
Let's talk about the problems with the draft bill. Outline what you feel those problems are, and also what your take is on how we're striking the balance with this legislation, the balance between opening up the industry and also trying to protect South Africans.
Absolutely, and it's a very important debate. Look, the Constitutional Court in 2018 afforded every single adult South African certain rights in respect of cannabis, and those rights were to cultivate, possess, and use cannabis in private spaces. And the majority of the criticisms of the bill center around the fact that there seems to be a clawback on prohibition. What the bill does is it starts talking about limits on the number of plants that you can go in private. Which then begs the question as to how this is going to be enforced without additional constitutional rights violations. Are the police without a warrant going to be authorized to come onto your private property and count the number of plants? And then above a certain number of mature plants, you are then presumed to be dealing in cannabis, even though there's no proof of that, or you've committed a statutory crime. So those really are the criticisms around it, is that the bill affords one less rights than were already afforded by the judgment of the Constitutional Court. That said, government's role when it comes to making law is to maximize personal rights and freedoms, but insofar as it purports to limit them, there must be a very good reason for that. And in this case, the reason to limit people's rights in respect of cannabis and other substances for that matter would be to limit harm, limit the harms to users and limit the harms to society at large. Now, one needs to only regulate insofar as one can be shown to be reducing those harms. Now, if you are using the criminal justice system, in other words, arresting and prosecuting people and putting them in jail under the auspices of preventing harm, well, you're actually acting unconstitutionally. You are inadvertently doing more harm to drug users and to society at large than you are preventing through using the criminal justice system. And that's where the balance comes in. So one does need to regulate to prevent certain established harms, but if you go too far, then you're actually doing more harm than one prevents. And we're saying that government needs to be very circumspect and only put in minimum barriers to entry and only regulate to the minimum degree that is absolutely necessary.
All right, Paul. Well, I guess the positive is that we're moving in the right direction, like you say, and not perfect yet, but hopefully we will get there eventually. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. Specialist cannabis lawyer Paul Michael Keichel.